It's amazing how even after all these years, the JFK assassination still has this, like, hold on us, you know? I mean, with these new files that just came out on March 18th, 2025, it's like we're opening up this old mystery box again.
Yeah, it really does feel that way.
Right.
And I think there's a reason this event just keeps drawing us back in. For a lot of people, the official story never quite felt like the whole story. And these new documents, well, they offer another perspective,
Yeah.
you know, another set of clues to try to piece together.
Right, and that's exactly what we're diving into today, the possibility of the CIA being involved in Kennedy's assassination. We've been going through all these new files from the U.S. National Archives, and we really want to break down the most important parts that point to the CIA and their potential role. We want to help you listening make sense of all this without getting, totally lost in the weeds.
For sure. So I think one of the things that jumps out right away from these files is just how intensely the CIA was going after Fidel Castro. This wasn't just about, weakening his government or something. They were seriously trying to assassinate him. This was going on for years.
Yeah, and across multiple presidencies too, right? It wasn't just limited to Kennedy. It started way back with Eisenhower, and the plans themselves were really something else.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The files actually lay out all these attempts on Castro's life, and it's wild. I mean, we're not talking about some rogue operation. This was coming from the top. It started under Eisenhower and then kept going when Kennedy took office. And the methods they were using, the people they were involving, it's crazy.
It's like something out of a spy movie, the U.S. government recruiting people from the mafia like John Roselli and Sam Giancana to carry out these hits. These weren't your typical spies.
Not at all. I mean, they operate in a whole different world with their own agendas and everything.
And the files even go into detail about specific incidents. Like there's this one from March 13, 1961, where Roselli actually delivered poison capsules to a Cuban contact in Miami Beach. These were supposed to be used on Castro. We're talking documented cash payments, rifles, the whole nine yards. It's pretty intense stuff.
It is. And this is where things get really interesting because there's this theory that comes up in the files. Could these assassination plots have actually backfired and led to Kennedy's death? The idea is that Castro, after surviving all these attempts, might have decided to retaliate, make a statement.
Right, and the files definitely touch on that line of thinking. There's this account from Roselli himself given before he was murdered in 1976. He suggested that some of the same mob figures the CIA used against Castro were also involved in Kennedy's assassination, with Lee Harvey Oswald being the triggerman. Now, we have to keep in mind this is based on Roselli's claim, so it's not necessarily a proven fact. But it's definitely a thread that runs through some of the documents.
Yeah, and when you start putting the other pieces together, it gets even more complicated. You have Oswald's documented pro-Castro activities, and then there's that strange trip he took to Mexico City just weeks before the assassination trying to get a Cuban visa.
Yeah.
It all adds another layer to this idea of Castro maybe retaliating because of what the CIA was doing.
Exactly. So we have this whole anti-Castro operation that could have potentially blown back on Kennedy, but that's not the only way the CIA might be involved. The files also reveal something else pretty disturbing. They were deliberately withholding evidence from the Warren Commission, the very group that was supposed to be investigating the assassination.
I know, right? That raises so many red flags. Why would a U.S. intelligence agency hide information from an official inquiry into the death of their own president?
The files suggest a couple of reasons for that.
Right. Well, the first one makes sense in a way, I guess.
Yeah.
They wanted to keep their collaboration with the mafia a secret. Imagine if that had come out at the time. The CIA working with organized crime to try and assassinate a foreign leader. The public would have been outraged.
Well, absolutely. It would have been a huge scandal. The CIA's reputation would have been destroyed. And then the second reason the files mention is they wanted to prevent, general public outrage. This probably has to do with just how ethically questionable and risky these operations against Castro were. Yeah, and there's this really specific example of this cover-up that comes up in the files. It's pretty damning, too. Robert Kennedy, the president's own brother, he was briefed about the CIA using the mafia to target Castro back on May 7, 1962. And just 2 days later, he told them not to do it without consulting him further. But guess what? This incredibly important information was never given to the Warren Commission.
And then you have the silence of people like Allen Dulles. He was the CIA director who authorized the initial mafia plot, and then he ended up serving on the Warren Commission. He knew all about this Cuba connection, but said nothing during the entire investigation.
No.
It's hard to believe he didn't think it was relevant.
And the files don't stop there. It gets even more complicated when you look at what happened right after the assassination. Within hours of Kennedy's death, the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City sent a cable suggesting a possible link to Cuba. And then the very next day, November 23, 1963, CIA Director John McConey briefed President Johnson about this possibility. But none of this ever made it to the Warren Commission. It really does feel like there was a deliberate effort to control the narrative.
For sure. And to make matters worse, the CIA has been refusing to release certain documents for years. They always cite concerns about privacy and protecting their sources and methods, but this lack of transparency has only fueled the speculation. It's like they're hiding something.
Right, and these new files are just adding more fuel to that fire. So let's shift gears for a second and talk about these circumstantial connections, specifically what was going on in Mexico City right before the assassination. We know Oswald went there to try and get a Cuban visa. What do these files tell us about what the CIA was doing in that same place at the same time?
Well, the files had this memo that lists all the CIA personnel who were stationed in Mexico City during this key period, from September 1st to December 31st, 1963. And there were also reviews of files related to Cuban exile groups that were active there, like the DRE, the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil. Now, the files, they didn't find a direct link between Oswald and these CIA personnel or the DRE, but the fact that they were all operating in the same city at the same time, especially with the CIA's known interest in Cuba and Castro, it definitely raises some questions. There could be connections that haven't been fully explored.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. And the DRE, they were actually being used by the CIA as an asset up until 1966. That's what the files say. So even though there's no direct evidence linking them to the assassination, their anti-Castro activities and their ties to the CIA are important context. It gives us a sense of the environment in Mexico City at the time.
Right. And then there's this weird detail about the Sylvia Duran case. It's in the files, too. It mentions this reported conversation where some people described as federals were supposedly offering money to an American, maybe Oswald, to try and influence what Duran said about Oswald being at the Cuban consulate. Now, Hernandez Armas, he denied this, but it still suggests that someone might have been trying to manipulate information about what Oswald was doing in Mexico City right before the assassination.
So we're starting to get this picture of a very active, very secretive CIA operating in a crucial location with a laser focus on Castro and a potential, even if it's circumstantial, connection to the person who killed Kennedy. It's pretty fascinating. Now let's talk about Robert Kennedy for a minute. The files seem to hint that he knew more than we might think.
Yeah, Robert Kennedy's involvement in all of this is really complex and kind of tragic. The files indicate that he was aware of the CIA's executive action plan to take out Castro. This whole operation was run by William Harvey and reported to Desmond Fitzgerald.
And he didn't stop it. Even though he was the Attorney General and had oversight of the CIA after that Bay of Pigs mess, the files suggest he didn't intervene to shut these assassination plots down. And that's huge when you consider how badly things could have gone wrong.
It is.
Yeah.
And the files also give us these glimpses into how he reacted after his brother was killed. There are notes that say he was completely devastated, haunted by the possibility that these plots he knew about might have somehow led to President Kennedy's death. One file even describes his attitude toward these covert activities before the assassination as being like a wide-eyed schoolboy's fascination. It's kind of a jarring image.
It is. It's like you have this serious, powerful figure who's drawn to this world of espionage, and then he's forced to face the devastating consequences of those actions. It's really sad. The files also mention that there are different accounts of how he reacted. William Manchester's description is different from what McGeorge Bundy observed, so there's clearly a lot of internal turmoil going on.
Absolutely. It shows just how much this affected the Kennedy administration on a personal and political level. So to get a better grasp of what these newly released files are telling us about the CIA's possible involvement, let's take a look at a few specific documents.
Okay, great. So let's start with file 157-10014-10242. This one has details about the CIA mafia plots, Roselli's account, and how they withheld evidence from the Warren Commission. What's the main takeaway here for our listeners in terms of the CIA?
Well, this file really supports the idea that the CIA's operations against Castro created this really dangerous and unpredictable situation. Roselli's testimony suggests a direct link between the people involved in those anti-Castro efforts and Kennedy's assassination. And then the fact that they hid evidence points to a possible cover-up. They were probably trying to protect themselves from the fallout of all these controversial activities.
Makes sense. Okay, what about file 104-10433-10209? This one mentions conspiracy theories and even connects Watergate to the assassination. How does that relate to the CIA?
This file, it doesn't directly prove that the CIA was involved in the assassination itself, but it does suggest that they might have been involved in other cover-ups and maybe even bigger conspiracies. It makes you wonder if this whole thing with the JFK assassination was just an isolated incident or if it was part of a larger pattern of behavior within the CIA.
Interesting. Okay, next up we have file 104-10337-10001. This one focuses on declassification efforts and includes CIA documents about Oswald. It also mentions privacy concerns. What can we learn from this one?
This one shows that the CIA is still being very careful about what information they release about this period. The fact that they're still withholding documents about Oswald all these years later, citing privacy reasons, just makes people more suspicious. It feels like they're still hiding something.
Right. Okay, and finally, let's go back to file 157-100-014-10242. This one also mentions Robert Kennedy's knowledge of the anti-Castro plots, the timing of the Amelash operation, and the DRE files. How does this all fit into our understanding of the CIA's possible role?
This one reinforces the idea that the CIA might have been indirectly involved.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Kennedy knew about their aggressive actions against Castro. And then you have events like the MLH operation, which was another CIA-backed effort against Castro that happened right around the time of the assassination. And then there's their connections to these anti-Castro groups like the DRE that were operating in the same circles as Oswald. All of this suggests that the CIA's actions might have unintentionally created the conditions or, opened the door for the assassination to happen.
So we have all these files coming to light, all this new information emerging. What does this mean for the public and for how we understand history, especially when it comes to the CIA's potential role?
Well, I think the immediate impact is that people are going to be scrutinizing the CIA's actions and motivations even more during this time period. There's this quote from a 1973 file that says, "We haven't yet heard the full account of the events of November 22, 1963. And that's still true today. These new releases are a reminder that there are still a lot of unanswered questions about Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah, and this isn't a new thing either, is it? The files even mention conferences like the Decade of Assassinations back in 1973, where experts were already debating this case and raising the same questions we're talking about today. This controversy has been going on for decades.
Exactly. People have been skeptical and searching for answers for a long time. These new files are just the latest pieces of a very complicated and long-running historical puzzle.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these new JFK files, specifically focusing on the possibility of CIA involvement, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Based on what we've seen in these files, it seems plausible that the CIA was involved in Kennedy's assassination. And there are a couple of main ways that could have happened. First, their whole anti-Castro campaign could have created a situation where retaliation was a real threat. And second, the fact that they hid evidence from the Warren Commission raises serious concerns about a potential cover-up. What did they know and when did they know it?
So even without that absolute proof that the CIA planned or carried out the assassination, the circumstantial connections, the timing of events like the MLH operation, and all the information that was kept secret during the official investigation, it all points to the need for more scrutiny and a closer look at the CIA's potential role.
I agree. The picture that's emerging from these files isn't crystal clear, but it definitely adds a lot of new layers to this story. And it makes a strong case for the idea that we still don't know everything about President Kennedy's assassination, especially when it comes to the CIA.
So as you're listening to this and thinking about all this new information, it really makes you think about the world of intelligence operations and how complex and secretive it is. What does this tell us about the potential for unintended consequences, how these covert activities can have ripple effects that we might not even realize until much later? And on a deeper level, what questions does this leave you with about the nature of truth and how hard it is to hold people accountable for events that have shaped our understanding of history in such a profound way?
Those are the questions we're left grappling with, I think. It's a sobering reminder that sometimes the full truth might remain elusive. But that doesn't mean we stop searching for it.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more explorations into these fascinating and often unsettling historical mysteries.
Always a pleasure.